What was the one survival secret that allowed Native Americans to stay warm through the most brutal winters in North America, on nights when fire was not an option? Picture it, a frozen plain at 40 below, the wind cutting through skin in seconds. No matches, no dry wood, no lighter. For anyone alive today, that scene is a death sentence within an hour. Yet for thousands of years, entire nations lived through exactly these nights, and not by luck. They raised children in that cold. They hunted in it. They slept through it. And here is the strangest part. The answer was never a bigger fire. It was never a hidden tribe or a forgotten ritual. In fact, the deepest truth of their survival had almost nothing to do with flame at all. Historians long assumed the answer was simple: more fuel, more furs, more fire. Every one of those assumptions is wrong. The real secret was hidden in three places no textbook ever pointed to: in the snow beneath their feet, in the earth below the frost, and inside the human body itself. Modern science is only now catching up with what they already knew, and what it is finding is quietly rewriting the history of human survival. Because the first of those three secrets, the one buried in the snow they walked on, changes everything the modern world believes about warmth. So what did they see in the snow that we still cannot? The first mistake most people make about survival is believing that warmth must be created. Fire, flame, friction, fuel. We assume that heat is something we build from nothing, that without a spark, the human body is helpless against the cold. But the ancestors of the plains, the forests, and the frozen north understood something we have almost completely forgotten. They knew that heat is not something you make. Heat is something you already have. And the true art of survival is not producing it. It is refusing to let it escape. That single shift in thinking changed everything. Instead of exhausting themselves searching for wood in a landscape buried under snow, they turned to the snow itself. To the untrained eye, snow is the enemy. Cold, wet, endless. But snow is not solid. Fresh snow is almost 90% trapped air, and trapped air is one of the most powerful insulators on Earth. The same principle used inside every modern down jacket, every thermal window, every high-tech survival suit, was already sitting in the drifts outside their shelters, waiting to be used. Communities across the northern reaches learned to shape snow into walls, to pack it around their homes, to let it bury the sides of their lodges until only a small opening remained. Outside, the temperature could plunge to levels that kill an unprotected adult in less than an hour. Inside, warmed only by breath and bodies, the air could hover near freezing, sometimes even above it, a difference of 40, 50, 60 degrees, produced by nothing more than the intelligent use of what everyone else called a wasteland. But snow was only the first layer of the secret, because if the sky above them held one hidden ally, the ground beneath them held another, and that one they trusted with their lives. What was buried under the frost that mattered so much? Beneath the frozen crust of any winter landscape, something remarkable happens. Just a few feet down, past the reach of wind and storm, the earth holds a temperature that barely moves at all. While the surface swings from bitter cold at night to brief thaw at noon, the soil below stays quietly, stubbornly stable. Native communities across the plains, the plateau country, and the woodlands understood this in their bones, long before any scientist gave it a name. They dug, they carved out pit houses, they built earth lodges with thick walls of packed soil and beams of timber, half sunken into the ground so that the land itself became part of the roof, the walls, the floor. Inside these structures, the earth did what no fire ever could. It absorbed heat during the warmer hours and released it slowly through the long, silent nights. Modern architects would later invent an entire vocabulary for this idea: thermal mass, passive heating, ground coupling, grand terms for something indigenous builders had already refined over centuries of trial and correction. Every doorway faced away from the direction of the killing wind. Every entrance tunnel dipped downward so that the cold, being heavier than warm air, would sink and stay trapped near the floor, leaving the sleeping area above wrapped in a pocket of gentler warmth. Every roof was angled so that snow would settle across it, adding yet another blanket of insulation, instead of being cleared away. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was decorative. Every curve, every slope, Every buried wall had been shaped by the memory of ancestors who had watched 100 winters and remembered what worked. The land was not an enemy to be conquered. It was a partner to be listened to. And yet, even the wisest shelter is only half the story. Because outside the lodge, out on the trail, out in the hunt, the human being was still alone against the cold, and the body itself would have to become the last refuge. But how could something as fragile as flesh survive what could break steel? There is a fire inside every one of us. It burns quietly, invisibly, without smoke or flame. It never goes out until the moment life itself ends. Modern science calls it metabolism. Native tradition simply understood it as the warmth we are born with. Every heartbeat, every breath, every bite of food converted into energy feeds this hidden furnace. And the great insight of northern peoples was this: if you cannot always carry fire with you, then you must learn to protect the fire you already are. Every element of daily life was shaped around that idea. Clothing was not chosen for beauty first, but for the way it held the body's own heat close to the skin. Layers of soft, tanned hide, layers of fur turned inward, layers of woven plant fiber, each one trapping tiny pockets of air, each one adding to the invisible shield around the body. Moisture was the enemy. A sweating hunter in freezing weather is a hunter with hours to live, not days. So movement was measured, paced, controlled. Elders taught the young to walk in a steady rhythm, to breathe through the nose, to rest before exhaustion, to strip a layer before the sweat began rather than after. At night, families slept close together under shared robes of buffalo, elk, or rabbit, letting the warmth of many bodies pool into a single, gentle heat that no single person could have made alone. Even the way a person sat by the entrance of a lodge, even the way children were wrapped and carried, even the way the elderly were placed nearest the most sheltered wall, all of it was a language of heat, a silent grammar of survival passed down without a single written word. But warmth cannot last on will alone. The body burns fuel, and in winter it burns it fast. Which raises the next question. What did they eat when the fields were frozen and the rivers locked in ice? Long before nutrition became a science, native peoples had already turned food into medicine, into memory, and into heat. Winter meals were not chosen for pleasure. They were chosen for endurance. Fat, once feared by modern diets, was treasured. Rich, calorie-dense, slow-burning. Animal fat was the closest thing to portable fire that the human body could hold. The most famous invention of all was pemmican, a quiet miracle of preservation. Dried meat pounded into thin fibers, mixed with rendered fat, and in many regions bound together with crushed berries, for a touch of sweetness and vitamins that would otherwise vanish in the cold months. Light enough to carry across vast distances, dense enough to keep a hunter alive for days, stable enough to last for entire seasons without spoiling. A single handful could restart the internal fire when everything outside had failed. Alongside pemmican came the harvest of the warmer months, carefully preserved and hidden away. Dried corn, squash, roots, and beans stored in underground caches that used the same stable earth temperature that protected the sleeping lodges. Berries dried in the sun. Fish smoked over patient, controlled fires in the autumn, so their protein could feed families in the deepest weeks of the year. Warm broths and herbal infusions were sipped through the day, not just to nourish, but to spare the body the enormous cost of melting and heating icy water inside itself. Even the timing of meals was thought through. Small, steady portions kept the furnace running evenly, rather than one heavy feast that would leave the body sluggish and cold hours later. What appeared to outsiders as simple food was, in truth, a carefully engineered system for turning the harvest of a warm world into fuel for a frozen one. Yet all the food, all the clothing, all the wisdom of the body meant nothing if the shelter itself stood in the wrong place. Because the land could either shield a family or slowly kill them. So how did they choose where to live? Before a single stake was driven into the ground, before the first pole was raised or the first stone was set, the most important decision had already been made. Where? The choice of location was not a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life. A poorly placed camp could bleed heat, invite storms, and drown its inhabitants in the invisible currents of cold air that flow through every winter landscape. A wisely placed one could feel almost gentle, even when the world around it turned lethal. Elders knew that cold air behaves like water. It flows downward, it pools in valleys, it gathers in low meadows and open bottoms, where it can sit undisturbed for hours after sunset. So camps were rarely placed in the lowest ground. Instead, they were set on gentle slopes, on the shoulders of hills, on ledges that let the killing air slide past below them. South-facing slopes were prized above all, because even the pale winter sun, weak as it seemed, still carried enough warmth to soften a wall of earth, or dry a stretch of hide draped across a frame. Behind the camp there had to be a wall of some kind, a dense stand of trees, a ridge of rock, a curve of hillside, anything that could break the wind before it reached the shelters. In the open plains, where no such wall existed, the answer was to build downward into the earth itself, letting the ground rise around the home like a mother's arms. Every entrance faced away from the prevailing wind. Every path between shelters was cleared with care, because a single fall into wet snow could rob a person of the heat they had spent hours building. Nothing was left to chance. Modern designers now use satellites, sun charts, and computer models to achieve what these communities achieved, with nothing but memory and attention. It was a science written in footprints and stories, in the tilt of a hillside and the shape of a shadow. But even the finest location could not protect a body dressed for the wrong weather, and the clothing they made would astonish anyone who thinks technology began with factories. What did they wear that modern engineers still cannot fully replicate? Every piece of clothing worn through a northern winter was, in its own way, a small machine. A machine for holding warmth, releasing sweat, blocking wind, and moving with the human body across snow and ice. There was no single garment that did everything. There was, instead, a system, layers, each with a purpose. The layer against the skin was soft and breathable, drawing moisture away from the body so the sweat of movement could not turn into a frozen shroud. Above it, layers of fur turned inward, trapped countless tiny pockets of warm air, the same principle used today in the most advanced insulated jackets. Above that, an outer shell of tanned leather or thick hide broke the wind, shed the snow, and carried the weight of the weather without cracking in the cold. Every seam was placed with intention. Hoods framed the head, because a bare head loses heat faster than almost any other part of the body. Sleeves were long enough to cover the wrists, where the blood runs close to the surface. Leggings shielded the thighs and knees, the very parts of the body that a horseback rider or a walker on snowshoes exposes most to the wind. Even footwear was a marvel. Moccasins lined with soft moss, with dry grasses, with the down of birds, kept the feet insulated against the frozen ground and absorbed the moisture that would otherwise freeze inside the shoe and cripple the traveler. Mittens, not gloves, were preferred, because fingers held together share heat, while fingers separated lose it. Every stitch, every strap, every piece of trim was the visible result of invisible centuries of learning. What today is called performance gear, engineered for weight, warmth, breathability, and movement, they had already engineered from what the land itself provided. There were no factories, there were no labs. There was only the patient hand of the maker and the memory of everyone who had come before. And yet even the finest clothing, the wisest shelter, and the richest food could not save a person who lost the one thing that mattered most in a storm. What was that missing piece? The thing without which everything else would fail. The greatest danger of winter was never truly the cold. It was panic. Fear is a thief. It steals breath. It steals judgment. It steals the careful rhythm of a hunter's steps and turns them into desperate lunges through snow that suddenly seems bottomless. Native elders understood this before any modern psychologist wrote a single word about stress response. They taught their children, from the earliest age, that the mind is the first shelter. If the mind falls, the body will soon follow. And so the young were trained not just to walk, hunt, and build, but to watch, to notice the shape of a cloud, the direction of a bird's flight, the stiffness of the grass beneath the snow, the way a wolf pauses before a storm. All of these were signs, and signs were survival. A person who could read the sky did not need to fear it. A person who understood the wind did not fight it. Movement was slow when it needed to be slow, and swift only when it had to be swift. Rest was taken before exhaustion, not after. Breath was drawn deep and steady, because ragged breathing wastes heat and warns predators. Even in the darkest, longest nights, when the wind howled against the walls of the lodge and the stars felt impossibly far away, the family circle would gather. Stories were told, songs were sung, not as decoration, but as medicine, because loneliness in a cold night is another kind of cold, and courage shared is courage doubled. The greatest survivors were not the strongest, they were the calmest, not the fastest, but the most aware. Winter, they understood, was not a monster to be defeated. It was a teacher, cruel to those who ignored its lessons, generous to those who listened. And the lessons they carried out of that long apprenticeship with the cold did not die with them, because much of what modern survival science teaches today began exactly there. So what did the rest of the world eventually learn from them, sometimes without ever knowing where the knowledge came from? Today, in classrooms for mountain rescue teams, in the training manuals of Arctic researchers, in the field guides of the most experienced wilderness instructors, the same principles appear again and again. Build shelter before you build fire. Stay dry above all else. Break the wind before you fight the cold. Eat fat. Move slowly. Rest before you break. These are not new ideas. They are the ancient ideas, dressed in modern language. Science has now measured what these communities intuited. Snow really does insulate. A properly built snow shelter can hold a temperature more than 50 degrees warmer than the air outside. The Earth really does hold a steady temperature just below the frost line, which is why buried root cellars still work, and why architects designing for extreme climates return, again and again, to the model of the half-buried lodge. Layered clothing really does outperform a single heavy coat, because it is the trapped air between the layers, not the fabric itself, that does most of the work. Fat really is the most efficient fuel for prolonged exposure to cold, delivering more energy per gram than any other source the human body can burn. And calm really does save lives, because the panicked mind burns oxygen and heat far faster than the steady one. Every discovery that modern survival science has certified, indigenous peoples had already lived, tested, and refined across countless generations. Their greatest strength was not any single tool or trick. It was flexibility. They did not depend on one solution. They read the land, adjusted to the season, and used whatever the moment offered. In an age when we assume that survival depends on equipment, batteries, and technology, their example whispers something uncomfortable. Tools break, batteries die, fuel runs out. But knowledge, carried inside a human mind, walks wherever the human walks. That may be the most powerful survival tool ever invented, and yet, even now, something even deeper remains. Something the fastest technology and the sharpest science still cannot quite reach. What did our modern world lose when it forgot how to listen to winter the way they did? The truth is that the story of Native American winter survival is not really a story about cold at all. It is a story about a way of being alive, a way of looking at the world in which the human is not the center, not the master, not the conqueror, but a guest. A guest who learns the rules of the house before making demands of it. For thousands of years, that way of seeing shaped everything. The shape of a doorway, the choice of a hillside, the stitching of a moccasin, the recipe for pemmican, the pace of a hunter's step, the song sung over a sleeping child on the longest night of the year. All of it was one great conversation between people and land, refined so slowly, so carefully, that its wisdom became invisible, like the air itself. And then, in the rush of another kind of civilization, much of it was almost lost. Not because it was inferior, not because it stopped working, but because a louder world moved past it without listening. Today, as our climate shifts, as energy grows expensive, as our shelters grow disconnected from the ground they stand on, as our clothing grows cheap and our lives grow warm inside, but strangely restless within, the old knowledge feels less like a museum piece and more like a message. A message from ancestors who never met us, but somehow knew we would need this one day. Warmth, they seem to say, is not the same as heat. Warmth is preparation. Warmth is community. Warmth is the willingness to sit still long enough to understand where you are. The fire in the hearth eventually goes out. But the fire of knowing, once passed on, does not. It travels through generations, through storms, through centuries. And on a night when the wind howls and everything modern fails, it may be the only fire that still remembers how to burn. That is the true secret they left behind. Not a technique, not a trick, a way of belonging to the world. And perhaps, in a century that has almost forgotten how to belong to anything at all, that forgotten warmth is exactly the one we need to learn again.